Welcome, everybody, back to the Founder Underground podcast. I'm your host, Ian Scott Cohen. Today, we are talking about a topic that can make or break startups: operational excellence. Joining us is Celeste Shields, the CEO and founder of Celeste Shields Operations, where she helps startups strategically manage their projects, programs, and metrics to scale sustainably. I love Celeste's perspective. She's always candid and on top of operational excellence, especially because it's a topic that oftentimes founders, we just don't even pay attention to. It doesn't even compute early on. So Celeste specializes in designing systems that maximize success while supporting founders and teams to avoid burnout. So in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to cover everything from setting early OKRs and KPIs, and I will define both of those terms for us, to addressing operational bottlenecks, choosing the right project management tools, because there's a gazillion, and a few more things I'm sure will come out of the conversation. So if you are an early stage founder or aspiring entrepreneur wondering how to build sustainable growth systems, you won't want to miss this. So Celeste, how are you doing today? Thank you for joining me.
Amazing. I love that intro. Thank you so much. I'm well. How are you today?
I am doing well. This is honestly, truthfully, this is one of the more favorite things I get to do. Just because, we could talk about new business and startup entrepreneurship all day long. So this topic is really, really critical for anybody starting any business, let alone a high growth startup, right? Because a lot of times we have ideas and then we try to bring them to life. And in the beginning, you're just kind of manually doing all the things, right? You're trying to make it work, trying to figure it out. But a lot of times what I found working with founders is they don't even know necessarily what to focus on in the beginning. So I thought that'd be a good place to start when we talk about OKRs and KPIs. And so actually, I want to start with, we'll start with KPIs because I feel like it's kind of an ambiguous topic that we all talk about. I'm not even convinced I always know what the right KPI is, but when we say KPIs, we're talking about key performance indicators. They show up a lot in corporate environments. And so for a startup or a new business, even if it's not like high growth, what's your advice when thinking about key performance indicators or, just measurable goals in the early stages that they can drive progress to without kind of overwhelming themselves or their team? How do you set those goals in the beginning?
So I actually like to start from the top. I feel like KPIs are actually at the bottom of this. So KPIs are important. It's important. The question you can ask yourself is like, what data would help me decide if we're actually on track, right? But how do you know if you're on track? In my opinion, that's where OKRs come in. OKRs keep you on track to basically make sure that you're hitting like whatever your strategy is for that year. The OKRs are the action plan for that strategy. And the KPIs are those like actual data points where we know that that action plan is being successful. So I kind of go strategy, OKR, KPI. And there's a world where sometimes KPIs are, I don't want to say this because I don't want to be too general. KPIs are awesome. Having these numbers and this data points that know that you're on the right track are great. But I said OKRs, and we actually didn't, I think get into the definition of those objectives.
Yeah, we'll do that results, for sure. Yeah.
Right. The key result sometimes has the KPI already baked into there.
Right.
So then you don't actually need to create a new subset of KPIs. So there's a couple ways that you can look at these, but that's why I like to start from the top to the bottom. It's like, what is the strategy for this year? Sometimes companies have multiple strategies for the year. They have a strategy around increasing revenue, for example, and growth. They have a strategy around product, for example, and product enhancements and features and things like that. So then it goes into the objectives and key results. Now let's create an action plan to meet that strategy. And then KPIs usually, in my opinion, come afterwards. And they don't have to come afterwards, but I think it's easier to figure out what those KPIs. See, I'm even messing up this jargon right now.
Too many acronyms. Yeah,
there's too many acronyms. It's easier to kind of create those KPIs when you know what your OKRs are. That's helpful.
Yeah, so let me zoom out for a second and put this in perspective for folks. So basically what we're trying to get at is you're an early stage founder and maybe you're a year in, maybe you're 3 months in, whatever, maybe you're 3 years in. And what we're talking about really is, okay, how do you take your big goals for the year, right? Like, what are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to, hit 500K in revenue, or we're trying to get our first users, or we're trying to increase our leads by 50%, whatever it is. And that even might be closer to, a KPI than a goal, but you get the idea. So we're basically, what this conversation is really about is how do you take those big goals that you have over a certain time period and break them down into actual measurable milestones that can guide what you do and what your team does every day. Because that's the biggest challenge for founders is how do you divide your time up, right? And a lot of times, there's the 80-20 rule BS, which I think everybody just uses that for blanket. It's like, 80-20 rule, right? No, what we really mean is like, most of your work as a founder, especially early on, you end up doing stuff that isn't actually valuable. It's not actually aligned to those real goals. Maybe you spend an inordinate amount of time designing your website or, posting on social media, but those might not actually be aligned to the goal you're trying to achieve. And so OKRs and KPIs are two sort of metric frameworks that a lot of startups, tech companies use to align their work. OKRs, as Celeste said, stand for objectives and key results. They come from, they're popularized by Google and a guy named John Doerr, who has a great book about it called Measure What Matters. And now it's sort of like, taken the tech world by storm and everybody uses them. But the basic idea is you have an objective, right? And then under that objective, you have several key results that are meant to quantify what it means to achieve that objective. So maybe we can make up an example, like a very basic one off the top of our heads. So what would be a good example, you think?
Yeah, and even just, I'll say the example, but one thing that I wanted to just touch on that you talked about is like, where do you get started, right? And sometimes I see people sitting there like, well, how do I create this objective? Some of the questions you might ask yourself first are like, what are the most important things to accomplish this year or this quarter? They really should be broken down into quarters, right? So what are the most important things that you need to accomplish this year? Or you can ask yourself, what is going to really move the needle this year? That is a good starting point, right? So if we go back to that strategy example I said around like increasing revenue, and maybe you say an objective that you want, like I see it as, and especially in What Matters, that book you're talking about, they say like the objective is the what and the key result is the how. So if the what is maybe like, what is actually going to move the needle, right? When it comes to increasing revenue, let's say in quarter one, we need to acquire 100 new customers. That is the objective, right? 100 new customers by the end of Q1, that is the objective. But how are we actually going to get there? That is, again, these OKRs created an action plan. The key results are the how. So maybe the how might be, we need to generate 300 qualified leads every month because we know that 300 qualified leads will turn into 30 paying customers, and we have 100 our objective is to have 100 paying customers by the end of this quarter, right? So these key results would be like generate 300 qualified leads, right? And some might argue that that's also a KPI. Like, what are your KPIs that quarter? Generate 300 qualified leads, right? And always have it time bound, have it assigned to someone. And the thing is that like, if you assign one person 300 qualified leads, right? Now, I actually think you take it a step further, and I'm maybe jumping a little bit thinking about project management, but how are you going to hit 300 qualified leads? How many calls does that take every week in order for you to hit 300 qualified leads? What does the work look like to actually close some of these folks, the 30 folks that you're anticipating closing that month? So this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but again, where did you start? You started by saying, we need to increase revenue this year. Right. Let me sit down and think, well, what is the most important thing to accomplish this quarter if we're going to increase revenue? We need to hit 100 customers, 100 new customers this quarter. How are we going to hit 100 new customers? 300 qualified leads, and we need to, and then you have another KPI that maybe is conversion rates. So the conversion rates, again, are that data set. And the conversion rate is, let's say we want to, I forget what that actual measurement of converting 30 out of 300. Whatever that conversion is, that 10%. Percentage is the KPI. And that's what we're focused on. So it just allows you to have almost like a roadmap. And knowing if you did well that month. So if you said you were going to convert 30 out of 300 that month, and you didn't, then what changes are you going to make for the next month? Right. And who's assigned to that? Who's responsible for that? What is assigned and due dates? They're going to go hand in hand in all of your operations, from project management to metrics tracking. you've got to have some clear boundaries around, were we successful or not? And I think that's what metrics allow you to do.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it's one of those things that I know, a lot of entrepreneurs end up coming from non-business backgrounds a lot of times, or from a very, a specialized background from their profession. And I think sometimes we get intimidated by even just like trying to put metrics down, or, put goals down, KPIs down, because one, like you might not feel comfortable with data, or you might not know like what conversion means or what conversion means in your context. You also, people I see get nervous around setting reasonable, or I should say feasible, but aspirational goals. It's like, how do you know what's a good goal to set? Is it high enough to really like move the needle, or push you to really achieve? Those are all like some of the more kind of opaque areas in this process that I think a lot of times scare people off. But to your point, like spending time setting these objectives and key results, I would argue is well worth it. They deliver huge returns in terms of time saved. Because to your point, it's like, if we know, let's say that I'll just use one of my past businesses as an example, right? So we were an ed tech company selling to schools, and we were only doing email marketing essentially. And so we had a long mailing list of these special education directors, and we had email campaigns. And so one of the things that having these goals helps with is to say, okay, if we want to generate, 20% more leads this quarter or something, I'm just making it up, then, and we think that it's going to be through email marketing, it just gives you another sort of externalized, bar or goal to say, okay, this is also why we should spend more time doing email marketing, which is our chosen channel. And I don't need to worry about creating a TikTok account necessarily, because it's not aligned to our strategy. And I find this happens all the time, especially with marketing early on. Like entrepreneurs and founders, we kind of get obsessed with like being present in the social sphere and feeling like, oh, if we're on LinkedIn posting, if we're on Instagram posting, if we're on Facebook, whatever, being out there shows people that like we're moving and making progress. But like all of those things have opportunity costs, right? You're giving up time. And so with an OKR and KPIs to follow, it's just one little way you can keep yourself honest and say, all right, is this activity I'm doing right now, this thing, posting a book on LinkedIn or something, is that actually going to lead to more leads? Maybe it will. Maybe your business does that channel, but most of the time it won't. So I love using this too as a way to help focus, right? I think that's a lot of the point, isn't it?
100%.
Is there a place that you've, working with startups where, do you find that, I guess, a lot of startups you've worked with already have some goals when you start working with them and they just need to be refined, or do a lot of them just kind of have nothing and they're just sort of winging it?
They do have stuff, actually. Yeah, believe it or not, I think people don't give themselves enough credit sometimes. Even folks who I talk to, they're like, I don't know where to start. I don't know what's going on. And I say, well, what's some of your goals for this year? And then they actually are able to verbalize a few things. Maybe they have it written down somewhere. Maybe they don't. Maybe they worked with a consultant in the past that helped them like identify like a 3-year plan or like some sort of trajectory, and it's written down and they haven't touched it in 6 months. But I'm like, this is a good baseline for us to start with. And now we can build off of this. And it is overwhelming when you do it. I love what you said, that it helps you focus but then you also don't know where to start. But once you actually start it and you start building it out, it feels a little overwhelming, but then you start seeing, oh yeah, this is going to keep us on track. You see the focus, the through line.
Yeah.
And then when you actually get to the end, I've never had someone who actually gets to the end of finishing it. They assign the key results, who's responsible for different key results, for example. There's due dates. They've organized it in some sort of platform of their choosing. I've never really heard anyone say like, this was a waste of time, ever. Truly, it's maybe a pain to create it. I'm not going to act like that part is easy. It's doable, but it's not the easiest thing in the world. But when you actually do it, both you and your team typically feel like, oh, I don't have to do all this random stuff that I was doing before anymore, because this is
Right.
actually, I know I've spent time thinking about, I know what's going to move the needle. And then the second piece of that is tracking, which you alluded to, of like, when you actually do try something and it's working well, you can take some other stuff away potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like OKRs are okay to be iterative. I think people think like, oh, they also get nervous about setting it up because what if like this is us for the next year? That's not
Yeah.
always true. It's a quarter to quarter engagement where you even look
Mm.
back and see what went well,
That's a
what
good
didn't
point.
go well. Are we going to make changes for the next time and things like that? But no, it's so important to leverage metrics when you especially when you have a team. Like I could argue that maybe
Mm.
solo entrepreneurs may or may not need to make it a super priority, but when you've got a team, you've got to be the leader. You've got to make sure
Yeah.
they know what is next for them and that they're spending their time most efficiently, because you're a startup. Everyone's doing everything at the same time. So like, let's
Right.
actually try
Right.
and create some efficiencies around a lot of the things that we're doing.
Yeah, and to that end, one of the things I like that you continue to emphasize is assigning, right? This is something that I find that
Mm-hmm.
founders, especially early on, if your team is small, or if it's just you and co-founders, there is this sort of weird tension to assigning responsibility to achieving a goal to certain people, because it's like you don't want them to feel like, oh, it's all on them, and it shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be, right? Almost every one of these goals you're going to set, OKRs, KPIs, whatever it ends up being, everybody's going to have some sort of contribution, most likely early on.
Mm-hmm.
And even if not, this is actually a better way to manage, right? I think a lot of times founders, when they start building their teams out, they get this daily sort of anxiety. It's like, how do I know my team's working, especially in the remote working world? It's like, how do I know they're
Mm-hmm.
doing anything? Like, what is she spending all of her time doing? Why is this not thing? I've had that happen so many times.
I
And
literally just had a call about that with a client who's just like, I
yeah,
don't know if they, I feel like they should be getting more stuff done. And I'm like, well, are they hitting the numbers? And they're not. So then that's the conversation you now get to have with them, because you have
right.
documentation of like what is expected. You guys have aligned on that. But yeah, keep going. Sorry. I just
Yeah,
literally
no,
had
that's
that call yesterday.
no, it's better to have a real example. It's exactly what I'm talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's so much room for, in the remote working world especially, but even if you're in person, you always, as the founder, you always want to feel like your team is on task and being productive.
Mm-hmm.
And you always also sit there, and especially if you're feeling down or maybe you lost a sale opportunity, and then all of a sudden you're like, we're not making enough progress. And then you're like, why are we not making enough? Well, my team's not producing enough. I need to work them harder because that's what pop culture tells me I need to do. That's what Steve Jobs did. One thing leads to another. You start making big assumptions about your
Mm-hmm.
team, and you start, questioning their work ethic. And that's where tension and resentment builds, and it can really tear a team apart. And
Yeah.
creating goals in these forms, what it does, and I teach people this from a psychological perspective, is it externalizes what we're all trying to do. A lot of times founders have a vision and people are working towards that vision, which is in the founder's head, and none of us can guess what's in their head. And it's never going to be exactly like what I do is never going to be exactly what you wanted if you don't actually write it down, externalize it, like bring it out of your head and onto paper. And then it's something we can all look at, all agree on, and all agree that we need to achieve. And that way, it's like when I come to you to check in on your work, I'm not micromanaging per se, although there are certainly ways you could still do that. But I'm able to say, look, hey, how's it going achieving this goal? Like, where are we?
Mm-hmm.
Knowing that it's not like me personally questioning your ethic. I'm actually checking in to see where we are on this goal, right? It's a subtle
Exactly.
difference that a lot of early stage founders I find kind of miss, that
Mm-hmm.
important side piece of it. It really relates to team and team cohesion too.
100%. Yeah.
So with that, I want to move on to bottlenecks. So in early stage startups, identifying operational bottlenecks can feel really daunting for early stage founders, especially again, if team personalities are involved. So can you share some signs that a bottleneck maybe exists and some
Mm-hmm.
practical first steps to address it, or even just to identify them?
Right. I mean, to identify them, that's essentially what I do with an operations audit. So that's one of the first things I typically do
Mm,
with clients who are looking for fractional COO support is we need to do an operations audit, a deep dive of understanding your operations. And I call them pain points, but it's kind of very similar to bottlenecks. And the question I
sure.
often ask them is like, what are some pain points acting as barriers to your company's success? Because it is sometimes hard to like sit here and think, where do I start with operations? Or how do I know
Yeah.
what is a bottleneck? Like, how do I know if this is actually like bad? Is this just like people not working efficiently, or is this XYZ? There really is
Right.
no perfect answer to this. And sometimes it's just about writing it down. But if you have trouble writing it down, a question that I usually prompt are like, what are some pain points acting as barriers to your company's success? Because again, going back to that success marker, knowing what your
Mm.
metrics are and knowing what success looks like for your company, what are some of the things that happen day to day where we're actually seeing, okay, if success looks like increased revenue, if success looks like 100 new customers, here are some things that are happening day to day that's actually stopping us from hitting it. Like we're having trouble hitting 200 calls in the month for whatever reason, or 200 leads, or whatever, that OKR was, right?
Yeah.
And when you can answer these questions, then you just start writing it down. So it's first, you're right, it's identifying it, but the next step is then creating solutions for it. But I always say, like,
Mm.
your company better than anyone, better than me. Like coming in as a consultant, like
Mm.
I can help you strategize and think of solutions, and I can even propose solutions. But if you don't even have someone like myself and you just want to get started tomorrow, identifying is first, and then creating solutions after that is second.
Sure.
But one thing I will say, to even as another helpful tip of like, if you going back to the identify piece, if you have trouble even answering that question of like, I still don't know where to start, just write everything down now, right?
Mm.
Just start writing out your workflows, your day-to-day workflows, your week-to-week workflows from you as a founder or for your team or from different departments and stuff like that. Maybe you make
Yeah.
it a team activity where every single person writes down all of their workflows. And then
Mm.
together you guys start seeing, well, which ones are actually like, where are we seeing pain points? Like an example might be like, we have to get approval from the founder every single time we do XYZ. And the founder is
Right.
overwhelmed and we're being delayed with getting approval. So now we can't actually close this client because we need approvals from the founder, right? That's like a random example.
Yeah.
But when you write it down, like you just mentioned earlier, writing it down makes it real, honestly. Like if it's all in
Yeah.
your brain, like how are you actually going to know? How are you going to share that information with your team?
Yeah.
So I would say those are two different maybe tips to help you identify it. Like try to answer this question, pain points acting as barriers to your company's success. Or if you're having trouble still figuring it out, just write everything down.
Hmm.
All the
Yeah.
workflows,
Sure.
identify what works. And then once you've identified it, that's when you can make a solution. And like I said, those solutions can be a number of things. And you can decide,
Mm.
okay, let's try this solution out. And you might try some solutions that actually don't end up being the best, but at least you're putting it out there to try and like combat a bottleneck. Because I even
Yeah.
say when you introduce new solutions or operational efficiencies, if you will, you need to give it time for potential iteration. It's not going to
Mm.
be the perfect solution from the get. But the point
Right.
is like, don't just keep having a bottleneck either. Let's try
Right.
and
Right.
have a
Right.
solution that, whether is it an automation that you can bring into effect? Like, is there, when you've identified that the approver is the founder, well, then what is the solution that you can create for that?
Hmm.
Is it, I mean, I'm having trouble thinking of stuff off top, but there's a chance you could likely use automations or AI as well to kind of create
Yeah.
some more
Well, let me ask you
efficiencies
this.
around it. So,
I would love to go rattle off a couple of examples of what
yeah.
bottlenecks have looked like from what you've seen with
Okay.
different startups you've worked with. So what are a couple like real examples that, because I think sometimes, especially operations, I think early on people are like, operations, it's too early for operations. I don't need all that. I just need to like, get my things done. But like operations is how you work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it also sets the foundation for how the business itself will grow or not grow, right? And
Yeah.
so as you're figuring out how you initially deliver your product or your service to your customer, like those steps are all part of the model, right? And so it's
Mm-hmm.
figuring out, how do we perfect this model over time so that it can grow and speed us
Yeah.
up or be more efficient. And so what are some examples of bottlenecks that you've seen before? The founder one's a great one, by the way.
Yeah, no,
We think
totally.
we
I mean,
both
that's kind of
know
goes into
what
this
that's like.
like overwhelmed leadership piece. Like I've seen that one a
Mm.
lot. Typically people are hitting me up because they're saying, I'm doing everything. I need to take a step away from the day to day because I need to focus on fundraising, or I need to focus on strategic ideation. I need to
Yeah, yeah,
focus
yeah.
on like sales or something like that. So overwhelmed leadership is probably the most common one that I hear. Lack of clear processes kind of come up as well, of being a
Mm.
bottleneck, because processes around, for example, your sales onboarding, like onboarding a new sales team, actually, because I'm conflating two ideas that I'm thinking of. I've seen processes
Sure.
like pain points of like hiring a new sales rep and you're feeling like they're not performing in the way that you're supposed to, but then that sales rep says, well, I don't feel like I know exactly how to be successful in this role yet because nothing is really written down. Maybe you onboarded them, but was that
Yeah.
onboarding fully verbal? And
Right.
do you have a, like, what you,
Yeah.
like you as a person
Happens a
might think,
lot.
well, I did onboard you, I trained you, but like, do they
Right.
have a
Right.
manual that they can go back to, that they can refer back to? So lack
Yeah.
of clear processes could be one. Onboarding a new customer, like maybe you're seeing like a bottleneck around your, I've heard of onboarding new customers is taking too long, right?
Yeah.
Where you're essentially trying to figure out, well, how do you reduce that time, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
identified the bottleneck of saying you can't even, like, you might even have a pipeline of customers that you're ready to onboard, but it's taking so much time to onboard the current ones you have. So I've
Yeah.
seen that be a pain point, and how you might rectify it though is really around that solution piece, because I don't, like I said, even thinking of these examples now, it takes time to figure out what a solution looks like for this. But
Mm-hmm.
once you're able to identify it, like I literally just write it down in a spreadsheet. So you kind of
Mm-hmm.
have your, you identify in an operations audit, you have your topics here. You have more data. Like, so if the topic is around onboarding a new client, in like maybe one column, onboarding a new client is a pain point or a bottleneck that we're seeing. The next step is talk about what that looks like. Write it down. Like, what is
Yeah.
actually going on right now with onboarding clients? You write down all the steps, and you basically say, well, could we actually automate some of these? Let's try that as
Yeah.
a solution. Let's
Yep.
automate this and then see if that works for us. Let's, sometimes you actually realize in the solution, you have to hire another person. Do you have budget for
Mm.
that?
Right.
Is that worth the cost? Maybe it is, right? So
Yeah.
I
Yep.
think it's daunting to think about, but I want to believe that spending, an hour just identifying everything, the solutions will come faster than you think, because you know this business like the back of your hand, especially if
Yeah.
you're in a leadership role or if you're the founder. So I don't know if that's helpful as far as like concrete
Yeah.
examples. Like some
No,
other
I
ones,
think
the
that's
other one I
helpful
can,
for sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give you two more examples that are right along those
Mm-hmm.
lines. So we did for our onboarding new schools and district clients, for example.
Okay.
That was a really interesting process because the first time we landed one, we didn't really know what onboarding was like, right?
Mm,
But we knew, like, okay, we have to have them sign a contract of some kind, right? We knew that we needed to do a training for
mm-hmm.
their teachers. We also knew we probably wanted to do a training for their leaders separately because they had separate tools and
Right.
separate priorities. So now all of a sudden we're starting to identify like steps, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so we just
Mm-hmm.
started putting these into a spreadsheet. Before you know it, it's like a 15-step process. And now some of
Okay.
these are big contracts, and it's an enterprise level customer in a school context. And so yeah, it might happen that way, right? But as soon as we started doing it, one of the things that came up was customizations. So customizing our platform, you could customize everything, which in retrospect was not good. Most people don't give a shit about customizing. They just want
Mm-hmm.
you to tell them the best way to use it.
Right.
But we didn't know at the time. So like customizing was like, oh, okay, we'll create a form that they fill out to tell us what customizations they want. But then all of a sudden we thought, oh, okay, this should help speed things up. But now what happened was they didn't understand some questions on the form. They
Mm,
also, more importantly, didn't fill the form out because
right.
they like signed
Mm-hmm.
the thing and they're
That's a
like, all right,
project.
tell me next steps, and then we send them 3 steps, and it's like takes 2 months for them to do 1 step.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of that is like stuff we learned. Eventually, we got rid of the form and just
Okay.
prescribed customizations later, and that worked just as well. It didn't actually lose any value, but it created efficiency on our end, which is a gain in value, right?
Okay.
And so some of this is like trial and error stuff. I think you
Yes.
could also look at it at the product level too, right? It's, and this is more product, user experience stuff, but same idea. It's like, are there steps that are holding your user back? Are there steps that are holding your team back from delivering for your user or buyer, right?
Mm-hmm.
I met with a school district once who was asking me if I could help them with their applicant tracking system process. So like a new teacher wants to apply to this school district, right?
Mm-hmm.
And be a teacher. And obviously we need teachers desperately. So you would think that the process would be smooth, efficient. Clearly it was not. There was actually, so she says to me, she's like, yeah, there's 4 phases to our process. I'm like, okay, that's an
Mm-hmm.
interesting place to start. She's like, only 50% of applicants make it through phase 1. And I was like, what
Wow.
do you mean? And she's like, well, just creating a profile on our system before you even apply we lose half of them. And I was like, that's interesting. And so I did the process myself. And I found that that first stage, this is just creating a profile on the district's HR portal so that you can apply. It had 89 questions on it. And I had to go through, I'm not kidding because I screenshotted everyone. I had to go 33 different screens just to get to the end of my profile. And then I had a survey, then I had an application, then you were supposed to have an interview, then a sample lesson. And it was like, yeah, okay, no wonder you guys aren't hiring anybody because no one's making it through this
Right.
thing.
100%.
So point being is like, it's really just, look at the actual, we do this in product design with user journeys, right? You could do this with your team, with your sort of team journeys, I guess, or, whatever, where it's like, to your point, if you want to do an audit yourself, just have your folks, what are the big things they're responsible for doing? Write out the steps for doing that one time through, or whatever the
Exactly.
cycle is, because it's so important. And a lot of times we uncover crazy things. You're like, how does this even
Exactly.
happen? Or what is? Oh, I haven't had the password to our Instagram account for 2 weeks. Well, why didn't anybody
Literally.
know? you know?
Why didn't anyone know that? And it's like
Uh,
until you actually have this dedicated time to brainstorm,
yeah.
it's like the privy information that is uncovered just makes such a huge impact. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's exactly
Should
what
this
you're
be
saying.
something? I'm assuming I know the answer to this, but how frequently do you think they should do something like this, where they kind of audit their own operations?
I would say minimum annually. I would say minimum annually, but when you actually bring something new in, you should have retros and iterate on that potentially every 1 to 2 months. So I would say that like you said, you put in the form. You mentioned the example of you put in the form to
Yeah.
basically try that out with your company to see if that was going to work. And
Yeah.
that was a very educated solution, I imagine. You guys took some time, you
We
realized the
thought, yeah.
bottleneck, you wanted, yeah, you thought it was an educated solution. You put it into effect. I'm not sure how long it took you to actually take it away, but eventually you took it away because you realized
Yeah.
this is actually not working, right?
Yeah.
Not every solution is going to work. So knowing
Right.
that it's okay to iterate on things, I think is really important. So
Yeah.
going back to how often should you kind of go back to reevaluating it, I say minimum annually. And that goes for your OKRs too. A lot of these operations, like annually is the minimum, but if you wanted to think about it quarterly or biannually, I do feel like you only know the answer to this as the
Sure. Sure.
founder. You kind of have to think about, well, how often is the company changing? Like I worked with a company where
Yeah.
we built out OKRs for a 12-month OKR plan, and they were growing so fast they were exceeding the objectives significantly. It didn't make sense. We had to iterate on it within 6 months.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, so
Yeah.
it really does depend on your company. I think you as the founder have to use your gut to make that decision as you continue to know your team and what's working well. But yeah, minimum 1 year for
Yeah,
sure.
no, I agree with that. And it varies so much. I will say to founders that this is one of the value adds of bringing someone like you in, even just for a short period. And
Right.
again, I know that founders think it's like early on you don't want to bring anybody in because you don't want to spend any money on anything.
Right.
But in reality, you're spending your time, which is your money, doing a lot of things inefficiently. And so if you are at a sort of an inflection point, or things have gotten kind of stagnant, you're not growing as much as you thought you were going to, bringing in an outside person just for a perspective is worth
Right.
its weight in gold, honestly. And a lot of times we shy away from it because we feel like we're not spending money on things that'll drive sales. But it's like, this is driving efficiency is helping your company stay alive too, right? It's helping you
Right.
save money. It's helping you turn more customer, whatever it is. And so with that, let's quickly pivot into project management tools, because there's a gazillion. My last team, I'm not kidding, we tried, I want to say 7 different project management tools, and they just
Really.
didn't click for us. But so obviously there's a lot of options. When do you think a startup should invest in these tools?
Right.
And how can they even just go about choosing one that meets their needs, or thinking about which one to choose?
Right. It is a hard answer to give you, and I don't think people will like my answer much,
Well, I'm
unfortunately.
sure it depends,
But
but
it
yeah.
depends. But like when you think about when, I think the minute you have more than one person on your team. And I know that that's not the everyone's favorite answer because like, no, when I have a team of like 10, right? That's when I bring on a
Yeah,
project
sure.
management tool. But the minute you have more than one person on your team, you guys are now doing two different things, right? You guys are doing different things that are going to move the needle for the company. How do you know when things are getting done? How do you know if you're on track? How do you know if things are getting delayed? What about, like, these are conversations you should be having in one-on-ones or in team meetings and stuff like that, right? So the thing about a project management tool, it's not this scary thing, because if you think about it like this, the project management tool, pretty much you only use it for like 3 or 4 columns. The task itself, or the project itself with tasks, who it's assigned to, and then a due date. Maybe you can have a status. Maybe you can kind of build off of that. A lot of people, you can go crazy with it these days with all of these tools that exist.
Yeah. Right.
But if you get it to be a little bit, a little bit more basic, and because I gave you such specific columns, maybe use a Google Sheet for a while if you want to save on it, and you only have 2 team members. But you need to have some sort of mechanism to track what people are doing and when they're doing it, right? Because it just allows you, again, to focus. Are you staying on track? And if things are getting delayed, can we get ahead of it? Like, can someone say, hey, I've been working on this and the due date is next Friday. There's no way I'm going to get done. Well, why aren't you going to get it done? Because of X, Y, Z. And now you can address maybe a bottleneck that you didn't know about just yet. Right. And you can get ahead of it. These tools just allow visibility across more than one person. Because if you're a team of one, you're doing everything anyway. You don't have to worry about it too much. Still, I think it's important to have one, but it's not the most important thing in the world, right?
Yeah, sure.
So when I have a very maybe controversial opinion of, like, when you got more than one person, you need to have some sort of like platform that is showing you who is doing what, when they're doing it, and when it's going to get done. Right. But then it's like, which one to choose? That is the hardest question to answer, because again, I'm going to go back to, like, you're the only one that knows a solution. You're the only one who knows the best tools for you, because you can ask yourself some questions around, like, well, what do I really need? Right. Are you tracking tasks and deadlines? Maybe Asana or Trello, Monday.com. These are kind of some good ones that you could be using. Is it more for software engineering? I know Jira is a really popular one for that, but there's still a ton of other ones. Like, I remember I heard about ClickUp a couple years ago, and I was like, what is that one? Like, when did that one
We
come
tried
out?
that one. We tried Asana. We tried Trello. Yeah.
Exactly. And this is the thing, is it might not work for you, right? But you have to also wonder, how are y'all using it? Is it, like I said, is it because you're using it in a way that's actually way more complicated than you need? Is it the way you're using it, or is it the actual platform, right? So this is actually where you might be doing a little bit more of an audit on, like, the process of how you actually use them.
I would argue, and
you
tell me, you tell me if this aligns with what you've seen. I would argue, and I'm going to say this also acknowledging that I have never been good about using platforms. Like, I'm always the one who screws it up, because you need everybody to buy in. But I would say that the chances of success with a project management tool directly correlate to the quality of goals that you've set as a team. And I think it's one of those things, like, everybody talks about, okay, well, if we're going to use this, we all need to buy into it. It's like, yes, that's true, right? And that is an important part of the adoption cycle. But I would also say, and this is why we spent so much time on the beginning, is like, if you don't have clear goals that you can break down into tasks and manage those, it doesn't really matter, because then it just gets confusing knowing, what do I put in here? When do I put it in? When do I update stuff? What's I'm meeting with you. We do a morning stand-up meeting. So why bother? And to your point, it's like, again, I 100% agree. I think if you have 2 people, even if it's a Google Sheet, just visualizing and committing to updating that, so that they don't need to text you when they're working at night. Or, you don't need information from them that's already there. It's just a way to save you each time and kind of respect each other's work, right? Which I think, 100%. Again, it's like, people shy away from project management because it has the word manage in it, and they think that's too formal, and nobody starts a startup to manage shit. But in reality, we're just talking about doing the thing right, Don't be afraid of it. This is going to help you. There's a reason this whole thing exists. There's literally entire degrees around management. A lot of those might be BS, but you get the idea. So I know we're coming up on time here, so I want to ask you one last question.
Yes.
And we should consider doing a series where we go in and review every project management tool, just like
Oh, that
go
would be
through it.
fun actually, because I have opinions, and I'm sure you do too. Because especially
Oh
if
yeah,
you've used a
yeah,
lot of, like I've used a lot, but I've not used all because I can't eat. I just use the ones that I love, and then when the
yeah.
client wants to use one that's different, they're legit all the same in my opinion. So then I just
Yeah,
learn how
yeah,
they
it's
use theirs.
always, and they all
That would
start
actually
using
be
the
a fun
same
one.
language. Yeah, and we
True.
find a way to structure it so that it makes sense. But I think that could be cool. And I'll come up with some sort of thumbs up, thumbs down system. But let me give you
Right.
this last question
Yeah.
around just scaling operations, because I think everybody likes to think about growth and achieving your
Hmm.
goals. So. A lot of times, again, as we kind of alluded to before, operations, internal workings, things, processes, lots of times get overlooked as we're all hustling to grow faster and to scale faster. So, if there's one system or process you think that startups should prioritize in their first year, what might that be?
Yeah. That I would probably say it's not a popular opinion again. Maybe I feel like operators don't always have the most popular opinions because visionaries are like, I don't like this. I don't want to do this.
Yeah, but
But
most people are not successful as entrepreneurs. And so popular
sure.
opinions aren't necessarily what we're after, right? I'm after
Right.
the
That's
the
fair.
good opinions.
No, totally. I mean, I got to say SOPs. I've got to say
Mm,
standard operating procedures are the ones that if you're going to choose one, you've got to document how you did something. You've got to
okay.
document it. Institutional knowledge is so important for an early stage company because things are often, people think like, oh, we're changing everything all the time. So you don't have to have institutional knowledge. And that's just
Mm,
not true. You've got to have a
right.
baseline of what you were doing. And then if something changes, then you make a new update to that SOP.
Yeah.
An
What
SOP can
qualifies
be
as an SOP early on? What might go into this initial.
whatever. So you can think of it like this. What is the question I usually ask? Hold on, I'm trying to remember. Like, what are things that you do often that maximize your success? Right.
Hmm.
So typically, what does success look like? We should count how many times we said success in this episode, by the way. But
Well,
what does
it's better aligned to success than anything else, right?
right. So what does success look like in the sales route, right? Let's take sales. Like, because I usually break up SOPs into different categories. So it depends on
Mm,
what's important to your company, and that's how we create some of
sure.
those SOPs. But if you're in your first year, likely revenue is always going to be important, right? So SOPs are around sales, right? If you have a killer way of like, I know how to close sales at this percentage, my conversion rate is this much, and you have the
Yep.
sales process that you've learned over time and you've nailed it down, and now this is like the perfect science. But it's
Yep.
all in your brain. If it's all in your brain, how is the like if you're able to make 200K just by yourself in your first year because you were the main salesperson and you want to
Hmm.
grow in the next year and you actually want to, that means you're going to bring on two new sales reps, right? And you
Yep.
need them to hit the ground running because maybe together you can each make 300K, right? However, I think for you to assume that that sales rep can make the same amount as you from the get is a little presumptuous. It's possible, but I would assume that they're probably going to make a little bit less. But besides the
Yeah.
point, this is a random example. And let's
Hmm.
say together you guys can each make 300K, right? But they're not being successful from the jump, and you don't know what's going on. But like that sales process again, you train them verbally, but did you write it down somewhere that they can now refer back to that playbook later down the line?
Yeah. And
So
so
in
when you
those
say write it
early
down, like
days,
are we talking about like every step of the process? Like I use this
yes,
template, I send it to this person, and I wait
yes,
this town. Yeah. So it's got to be like literal step by
step
step
by step.
journey. So that's why sales is such an easy example, right? Because the best
Hmm.
salespeople, they have an entire system, right? They have a process. It's
Right,
like, I'm going to send them this email, and that's why you have automation for this. And then 3 days later, I'm going to send them a follow up. 6 days later,
hmm,
whatever it is.
exactly.
So yeah, it's literally like documenting the steps and
Hmm.
ideally the resources that you use along the way, right?
Exactly. And that's when you get to a little bit more advanced SOPs. So because again, people don't like the standard operating procedure. Like, I'm never going to use it. Like, why is it here?
Right,
But
right.
you will. You might not use it right now when you're making it. But you said you wanted to grow, right? That means you're going to have a team at some point. So
Yeah.
that's when you're going to leverage it the most, actually. And the bare minimum is exactly what you said: step one, step two, step three, step four. When you get a little bit more advanced, if you will, you can add the purpose of this document. You can add the roles and responsibilities of
Yeah.
people who partake in this procedure. You can add
Sure.
resources that exist in it. But if you don't even want to get into all of that, create a template. That's the first thing. You make it even easier. What's the template that you use to create this SOP for your company? And then create multiple SOPs that will, first off, are very repetitive, that you do often. And these repetitive actions allow you to be successful as a company. So there's ways you can look at it for product, sales. I've seen customer onboarding ones. I've seen hiring SOPs where it's like, hey, every time we hire a new salesperson, here's the onboarding process that we use. Because if you're just figuring it out as you go every time, you're just not being efficient. So
right. And again, people are gonna kind of beg off. They're like, oh, it has the word standards, procedures in it, and so I don't want to write it down. But again, it's like, okay, if you're trying to build, if you have a big vision for a massive company or a very successful small business, then you need to respect the quality of your vision. And in order to achieve what you're imagining, it's going to take the mechanisms, processes, operations to deliver what you want. That's what you want. Every founder wants everybody they hire to act just like them, basically, and have the same vision. That is what SOPs do for you, right? Again, they externalize your vision and put it into something that's manageable. I'll close with this metaphor, reserving the right to have future conversations, Celeste.
Yes.
This is something, so I am a bit of a history buff, and I took art history as a subgenre I've had some exposure to. But Michelangelo, everybody knows Michelangelo, hopefully. And the Sistine Chapel is probably his most famous work, right? It's in the Vatican. Really amazing painting that took multiple years to paint, from what I remember. What people don't often know is that before he was able to paint the ceiling, he had to build the scaffolding. And the scaffolding took months. And so when you're building a business, I very much view stuff like this, where you're working on the business and not in it so much, as building that scaffolding that's actually going to enable you to make your piece of art, right? To realize your vision. And if you pretend like it's not important, you're never going to be able to reach those heights. Close metaphor. And,
no, totally.
And it's just one of those things that I think as you get into it, you start to respect more. But if you slow yourself down and say, you know what, I'm going to document what I'm doing. And that way, it'll also make it easier for friends, advisors, investors, anybody who's coming in to help you. You could say, hey, here's what I've been doing. Help me identify ways I can improve this. Your SOPs in the beginning might be just, I just wake up and I send 1,000 emails. Okay. Cool. Well, let's dig into that, right? At least it gives a place to start, And so I'll end us there. But Celeste, this has been really great. What an incredible conversation with Celeste Shields. Once again, I hope you're leaving this episode with some fresh ideas of how to approach your OKRs, setting your early goals, tackling bottlenecks, and building systems that grow with your business or startup. Celeste's advice really drives home the importance of balancing this operational excellence with sustainability, right? This is about growing a business long term. So for more info about Celeste, you can visit her website, www.celestialoperations.com. I love that. Or find her on LinkedIn, Celeste Shields. If you found this episode of the Founder Underground podcast helpful, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe so more aspiring entrepreneurs and founders can benefit from these insights. We'd love to hear from you too. So if there's one change you'll be making to your operational strategy after hearing Celeste's tips, just let us know in the comments, tag us on social, all that good jazz. Otherwise, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Celeste, once again. And
thank you.
Let's keep getting after it.
Absolutely. Good times. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.